unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are recording on Monday, April 22nd, just a day before the third phase of the polls get underway. Joining me to discuss the latest political developments in India is Sadanand Dhume, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and Tanvi Madan, director of the India Project and fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution. Guys, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
Good to be back as well.
So last week, the ruling BJP announced it would field Sadhvi Pragya Singh Thakur from the Bhopal constituency in Madhya Pradesh. Thakur was arrested for her alleged involvement in the 2008 Malan terror attacks. She is out on bail, but quickly joined the BJP last week to great fanfare and will be contesting these elections against the Congress heavyweight, former Chief Minister Digvijay Singh. Sadanand, let me start with you. Thakur's nomination generated intense controversy online and on the edit pages of most Indian dailies. Why is her nomination significant, and what do you think it tells us about the BJP's campaign?
We often sort of talk about things, marking a new low. And I think that this time you can really say that without exaggeration, because this is a person who is under trial under very serious terrorism charges. She's known to she hasn't been convicted, but that says more about the courts than about the charges against her, which do seem well-founded. Now, she is accused in a case where a group of terrorists decided to target innocent Muslims in retaliation for bomb blasts against Hindu targets in other parts of India. And the fact that the BJP has picked someone who is so extreme by any standard imaginable says effectively that they are moving, they're willing to gamble, and they're willing to move the political discourse in India to a place that it's never been before.
So would you put this on a par with selecting, say, someone like Yogi Adityanath as UP Chief Minister, or is this in an entirely different category?
That's a good question. Sort of, yes and no. I mean, this is, if you were to sort of, plot these people on a continuum of extremism, Sadhvi Pragya Singh Thakur is just about as extreme as you get. And the fact that she's being nominated to run for parliament is a big deal. On the other hand, I would still say that the Yogi Adityanath nomination was, to me, even more troubling because of the post he was given. She is going to be, if she's elected, she's going to be one of 543 MPs. He is effectively leading India's largest state.
So, Tanvi, I want to ask you about national security and whether or not the BJP's embrace of Thakur, who I should point out is still awaiting trial on terrorism charges, does this undercut the ruling party's objective of making 2019 a national security election by putting someone who's sort of terror accused so prominently in the fray?
So I think I'd say three things here. One, I think with the voters with whom this kind of national security rhetoric was kind of resonating anyway, I suspect it won't kind of go against the narrative. They're buying into it because either they want to or they already see the BJP as kind of being strong in national security, so to speak. The second thing kind of I'd say is that I think this signals that when we call it, or it's been called a national security election, it's not really a national security election. It's a national security rhetoric election. In that what we've heard is kind of a lot of people claiming, and particularly the ruling party, claiming to be the guardian of national security. But if this was a national security election, we'd be hearing much more about the defense budget, infrastructure building on the China border, or whether the police has enough capacity and funding, for example. So I would say this is a national security rhetoric election. We haven't seen much evidence of the opposite. And finally, I'd say in terms of kind of the BJP's broader message, because the campaign at some point would end, and we'll go back to actually having needing these parties to govern, is that the BJP has said, and the Indian government has said, as the kind of government, they've said, listen, we are against terrorism anywhere, there's no justification, and that you have to go after terrorists, whatever they are, whatever they say. This kind of does undercut that Indian message. And the BJP's rebuttal that, well, there's no evidence and she's not been convicted, that sounds an awful lot like what the Pakistanis say when India says, why aren't you doing something about this or that person?
I think one of the most remarkable pieces I read the past week was this lengthy interview that Amit Shah, the BJP president, did with the Indian Express. And he was pushed actually repeatedly on multiple issues by the reporters who were interviewing him. And when asked about Thakur's nomination, he said, and I just want to quote, "What is the objection here? Isn't Pragya Thakur a citizen? She's not eligible for fighting elections? Question mark. The Congress made an attempt to defame the entire country in the name of Hindu terror. This is a country where we feed even ants that bite us." Sadanand, do you think that most people will find Amit Shah's justification, in line with their own views?
Many people may, but that doesn't make the justification any less preposterous. I mean, let me put this in perspective for your American listeners. This is as though if the Republicans were to nominate someone who was involved in a white supremacist attack that killed black people, and if you were to turn around and criticize it, and if they were to justify that in terms of, well, isn't this person a citizen of the United States, and why are you maligning all white people? It's a preposterous argument. Nobody's saying she doesn't have a right legally to stand. What people are criticizing is the fact that the BJP has chosen a figure who is so extreme and who has been accused of such horrific crimes to represent them in parliament. And that is valid criticism, and what Shah is doing is trying to evade it. It's a different matter that this kind of evasion, in fact, does play well with many people. That saddens me, but that seems to be true.
I want to switch gears for a second and talk about the role of the Election Commission this general election season. Political scientist turned politician Yogendra Yadav wrote, I thought, a pretty powerful piece in the print this week saying, he is one of the many admirers of the Election Commission, believes it's one of the most respected independent agencies in India, but has come to the conclusion that it has not been behaving in a fair and an impartial manner. And he says in the piece, far from standing up to the powerful so as to frustrate their attempt at poll capture, I believe the Election Commission has appeared either complicit or helpless or both. Sadanand, let me start with you. How do you think the EC has acquitted itself this election season?
I think that a lot of that depends on where you stand. I would agree that there have been the institution has been proven to be weaker than we would have liked, but I don't think they've been that bad. Right. So, for instance, they did manage to ban Yogi Adityanath for campaigning for a few days, even though he's a powerful BJP leader. The larger question really is that can independent Indian institutions really control powerful political figures? And the answer we're seeing over there is they cannot. And this is just one example. It may not be the most egregious example, but this is one example where you see that the BJP, because it's led by this charismatic leader, is able to flout rules. I mean, you could look at the tax authorities, you could look at the central bank, you could look at a range of Indian institutions are not able to control powerful political actors. Along that spectrum, do I think the EC is doing a good job? No. But along that spectrum, is this the most egregious example of institutional failure or institutional capture? I would say probably not.
I think the other thing is, we are seeing other institutions jump in the fray. So the fact that we even know about some of these issues, or the press pushing the EC to kind of take some of these steps to, say, ban somebody from campaigning for 48 hours, or the Supreme Court, or the Madras High Court, for example, coming out and saying you need to do something, you can actually interpret your powers more expansively than you suggest. So I do think you can have others kind of pushing them to do things, but at the very least we have seen some inconsistency from them. And while it's not getting kind of as much attention, we're talking about the bias point, but also this thing we're hearing reports, we don't know how widespread they are, but I do think there'll need to be an assessment of people not finding their names on voter rolls and things like that. So that is something that shouldn't be an institutional failure, institutional question in terms of, how they're dealing with the ruling party, but more just kind of, did they drop the ball somewhere on communication?
I think there can be a danger sometimes in putting too much emphasis on this question of political interference and political bias, because then we lose out at what are just failures of competence or carrying out your duties, right? And I think that's where the deletion of voter lists sort of, comes into play. I think another thing about the Election Commission, which I found quite interesting, is they had initially gone to the Supreme Court saying, our hands are tied, we're not that powerful, there's not much we can do. And then within a matter of days had managed to suspend, half a dozen political leaders from campaigning. And the court sort of said, well, it looks like you've discovered your powers all of a sudden. So, that leads me to believe, do you guys think it's really about leadership, that if you have a TN Session-like person, or even some would say a Qureshi, who is quite an outspoken leader, you can kind of use that stick of the EC's kind of bully pulpit to get things done? And this is just a case of maybe, bureaucrats being too bureaucratic?
I'd say leadership counts for a lot. I think there's also a question of competence. And you can see, again, this is a pattern where very often the ruling party will try and put someone in place who they regard as well disposed toward them, but that person may also end up just not being the most competent person. And I think both of these things seem to go together.
Also, I think people have to remember, sometimes I think political parties, and we've seen this with political parties of all stripes in India, is they sometimes take steps assuming they're always going to be in power. They find themselves in opposition. And, on something like this, you'll suddenly have the guy who then will have to adjust to whoever the new kind of dispensation might be. So I do think leadership matters. But I think there's also, in favor of the EC, for one, it's great that they actually exist. When we look at some of the issues here that we've had, if there had been an election commission, we wouldn't have had it. So while I think there are kind of corrections that need to be made, I don't think, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I would agree. And if you compare it with elections in the 80s or in the pre-session era, there's no question that things are better now than they were.
There are questions, I think, to be asked, going back to the Pragya Thakur issue, which is one of the things Amit Shah said, well, she is eligible, is do we need to have a discussion about the rules? Should somebody charged with terrorism be even allowed to contest the election?
I want to end by asking you guys about your impressions about the vote so far. Many commentators have pointed out to say, the turnout growth has been pretty modest from 2014. Maybe this is a sign that things aren't going that well for the BJP. They've said, look, the BJP in 2014 did much better amongst first-time voters and previously, quote-unquote, silent voters. Sadanand, do you think that we can read anything into turnout thus far in terms of, the hava, the momentum of this campaign?
The short answer is no. It's certainly true, traveling, that you don't have the same kind of enthusiasm or excitement or electricity that we saw around the 2014 elections. But we don't know how that affects, you've written about this, and we simply don't know whether this means that the BJP is going to fall short because the young, enthusiastic voters who voted for it in large numbers are not showing up, or whether, in fact, the BJP is going to do just fine because it has a very organized, cadre-based organization on the ground, and it's going to be able to pull out more of its voters. So the short answer, we don't know.
I agree. I think, what we don't know is who is not showing up that showed up the last time around. And we could actually see, one of the things we've been debating is why is the BJP using so much polarized rhetoric in this election? And one reason might be is they're trying to get their base out. So is it effective? And is it turning other people off, or people who would have otherwise said, listen, I want to vote. They're not there where they'll say we'll vote against this guy. They don't want to vote for anybody else. So they just sit at home, which will actually help the BJP. So I think it's too early. Maybe I think one of the bad things about this election being so long is it's just a lot of speculation, and we just don't have the answers. And everybody could do with a research methods class in terms of how to interpret some of this stuff.
People are kind of looking for tea leaves to kind of ponder. We just looked at some numbers of turnout, and what we found is despite the gloom and doom about turnout is basically on par with what it was in 2014. It's about 0.7% less. But we have to remind our listeners that 2014 was the highest turnout ever.
That's
so
right,
we're basically seeing potentially a repeat of the highest turnout ever. So it's not exactly as if we're working, from a very low base. I want to end the session like we do every week by asking you guys to share with our listeners one story coming out of India that you think people should be paying attention to that they have not been. Tanvi, what would be on your list?
So there was a really interesting piece last week, I think it was in the Mint, about how the South looks at elections differently. And pointing out that the North, and particularly Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state, gets way too much attention because it just as a single state has so many seats. but that the South has collectively, I think it's about 130 seats. And is very diverse. The BJP has been trying to make inroads, and one of the things we'll find out in this election is, are they able to make inroads in a place where their kind of Hindu nationalism, Hindi nationalism message hasn't resonated, but their Indian nationalism message might. But I think that's a larger kind of story about how we sometimes get caught up in a Rahul versus Modi or kind of a very kind of North Indian thing, that the diversity across the country, and we'll find out in Orissa, in Bengal, and the Northeast, as you've written before, but also just that they're almost like multiple elections happening at the same time and not just kind of one large election.
It's funny, to the extent the South comes up, it's usually as, will TRS be a post-poll partner of the BJP? Will Jagan Reddy be willing to do business, as opposed to actually what's happening on the ground? Sadanand, what's on your list?
So I'll stick with the southern theme there. I think one of the most fascinating stories is the contest in Tamil Nadu for the legacy of the late Jayalalitha, the former chief minister known as Amma. And there's a party called the AMMK, which is led by a former confidant of hers who happens to be in prison, but is now being fronted by the person who's in prison's nephew. I mean, the whole thing is like fascinating soap opera. And
is there a flowchart or family tree?
You need one, but it's actually it's important because there are 40 seats if you include Puducherry, and traditionally, the way Lok Sabha elections have often gone in Tamil Nadu, they've swung either for one grouping or another. And what this kind of legacy party, or this AAMK, which is a new player, what it's going to do in this election, I think it's extremely important. I think hasn't been covered enough.
So thinking about who had the best week in India this week, Tanvi, who would you nominate?
So I struggle with this one because sometimes, it seems a little bit kind of, it's been a fairly kind of fear-based negative campaign. But I did find one today, which is kind of the entrepreneurial spirit of Indians. Who there's a guy who I will not name, but a famous hairstylist who has a range of franchise of hair salons, who has joined the BJP, saying that he's using the BJP's chowkidar or guardian language, saying, I used to be the guardian of your hair, now I'll be the guardian of the nation. And I was just struck by, nobody's going to vote on the basis of this guy joining, but just the entrepreneurialism of using kind of the Indian elections to, sell a few more haircuts is quite something.
I will admit that Sadanand and Tanvi gave me a quick tutorial on who this guy was before we started. I first saw it and I thought it was a parody. It turns out this actually was a real thing. Sadanand, who had the best week in India?
I think Naveen Patnaik's workout routine. Maybe not just this week. This has been out a little bit longer. But this is the chief minister of Orissa. He has been rumored to be in very poor health. And so he then released a video showing him, ostensibly trying to prove that he is, in fact, not in such bad health. I would urge people to go on YouTube and watch it. Certainly, for me, the winner of the week.
He was doing laps sort of in his official residence in the lawns. Okay, from the best week to the worst week, Tanvi, who had the worst week in India?
I think opposition unity in Delhi. The fact that the Congress today announced its slate of candidates for Delhi, there had been some expectation that they and the Aam Aadmi Party would form to try to get the opposition to coalesce versus the BJP, that they would form a coalition, a pre-poll coalition. That hasn't happened. So one of the questions we have is, do they then split the vote? Or does this somehow get sorted out in a way that, or have they just lost the election already by kind of not coalescing around each other?
So my favorite one-liner about this was the piece that Raghu Karnad just put out in The Wire, where he said basically the Congress is too busy trying to think about the future as opposed to winning this election. He said if the manifesto was woke, their strategy is broke, which I rather like as a nice bumper sticker.
I mean, I would agree with that, but I would actually say the person who had the worst week out of that is, in fact, Kejriwal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's Kejriwal whose national ambitions have really shrunk to the 7 seats in Delhi, and now he faces the very real prospect of losing many of those, right? So the opposition as a whole is obviously a loser because they haven't. But I think the bigger loser is Kejriwal, because we're really looking at his future as a national politician that's at stake here.
I mean, we might be proven wrong on kind of the 23rd or 24th of May, but one of the big questions I suspect we'll be trying to figure out is if this is an existential election, like Rahul Gandhi and other opposition figures have said, then why don't you do everything it is to ensure that there's a joint coalition? And we haven't seen that. So will they be proven correct, or will we be asking that question? I think on May 23rd or 24th will have a huge amount to do with what we see as the results.
And what I find very confusing in this story is there's a kind of he said, she said sort of routine, right? Where first it seems as if the Kejriwal was playing hard to get. Then he turned it around on the Congress, saying, in fact, you are the ones who are preventing the alliance. We want to do a deal with you. And it kind of has been going back and forth on Twitter to the point now where it looks like, given that they've both announced their slate of candidates, perhaps past the point of being able to stitch something together. Tanvi, Sadanand, thanks for joining me this week.
Good to be
Thanks,
back.
Milan.
After a quick break, I'll be back to talk with veteran journalist Barkha Dutt on fake news, the Modi phenomenon, national security, and much more. Stay with us. Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My guest on the show today is Barkha Dutt, an award-winning TV journalist and anchor with more than 2 decades of reporting experience. Barkha is currently a columnist for the Washington Post and an anchor with Tiranga TV. For her journalistic achievements, she was awarded the Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian honors. She joins me in the studio today in Washington, D.C., on the sidelines of the Georgetown India Ideas Conference. Barkha, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So first off, tell our listeners, what is Tiranga TV and how's it going?
So Tiranga TV is a new English news channel, and it's been launched a couple of months ago. I do a nightly primetime show on it, as well as a weekend show. Some of our other prominent anchors are Karan Thapar and Simi Pasha, and we're hoping to restore some sanity to the primetime news landscape. And our 1 mantra is no shouting, and we do want to show that television can be about the pursuit of ideas.
So you will not have 12 headshots arrayed across the screen.
No
with people...
postage stamps or Ravan heads, as we call them.
Okay, so this is substantive news that delivers clear arguments and messages without being argumentative.
And I think emphasizes the diversity of viewpoints. There is no ideological leaning in my program. I would like every affiliation or ideology to have equal space and play.
So let me stay on the topic of the news for a moment. You know, if 2014 was India's first social media election, many people are saying 2019 is the country's first fake news election, right? We've seen horrifying reports coming out of India on the way in which politically motivated actors are using technology to inject, misinformation into the discourse. In numerous examples, this hasn't just led to, threats of violence, it's actually led to actual violence. How would you characterize the role of social media in these elections in 2019?
Well, I think social media and fake news have become vehicles for manipulation, hatred, and bigotry. And I think that India has only just about started waking up to the perils of this. I think here in the United States of America, the backlash came much earlier. There was pressure on social networks like Facebook and Google to do much more to contain fake news. I think in India, we have finally understood that political campaigning takes place right now essentially through WhatsApp. Like, we cannot underestimate the power of WhatsApp as a tool of political communication. You have political parties dedicating like entire massive armies of people just to communicate images, jokes, humor, slogan, everything on WhatsApp. And if that space gets corroded, as it has, if that space gets corrupted, as it has, then I think you start calling into question the integrity of your electoral process. Now, as you know, Milan, WhatsApp has taken a few steps to contain this. So if there is a limit on the number of forwards, the forward comes marked as a forward, so you know that you should be probably double-checking its genesis. But the fact is that we're very behind the curve on this, and there is a serious problem with fake news and the impact on the political landscape.
So, I was interviewing last week Snigdha Poonam, whose book Dreamers talks a lot about young voters, and she's been doing a series for the Hindustan Times on first-time voters. And what she said was quite interesting, which is that Facebook is dead. People have moved beyond Facebook. I mean, obviously they still use it, but the game is WhatsApp, TikTok, these smaller chats that we don't even actually focus on.
Yeah. And I like every day I wake up in the morning and I've been added to some WhatsApp group, some, Vande Mataram or Hindu Jagran Samiti, or like, I don't even know who they are. And the volume of traffic and the communities that they're creating. And here's the thing, like, political parties know this, that I think WhatsApp itself hasn't woken up to just how much at the center of the Indian election it is this time. And TikTok, I mean, it started off as like some, like, partly funny thing, but it is such a mass vehicle, and I don't even think most Indians right now, except the ones using it, even know about it.
Right. You spent a lot of your career covering national security and foreign policy, and that has emerged as another theme this election cycle. Perhaps most famously, your work covering the Kargil War in 1999. Tell us how you see the recent India-Pakistan tensions playing into this election. A lot of people, when they're asked this question, they sort of hedge. They said, well, in the past, it's not clear what Kargil did to the NDA, what 2611 did for the UPA. Do you see a difference this time around in terms of this impact? How would you characterize it?
So obviously, if you pull out the data from the past, you will see, and that's probably what people have pointed you to, that after Kargil actually did not show a percentage increase for the BJP. After the Mumbai terror attacks of 2611, when you thought the Congress would go down, it did not actually do that. The reverse happened.
Increased hugely in terms of seats.
Yes. However, there is something very different going on now. It's the environment in which this terror strike took place in Pulwama in Kashmir. And I remember writing in the Washington Post that day, everything will change after this attack in Kashmir. And people were like, why have you said this? There have been terror attacks before. And I said, no, not like this. This is the worst attack in decades. And the response is going to be different, because that was clear to me that the Modi government was not going to, it had already sort of shifted the goalpost with the first surgical strike after the terror attack in Uri, and it had to do something bigger. It had to do something more assertive, more dramatic. Now, given the strike inside Pakistan, which took place in Balakot, the airstrike to retaliate for the terror attack in Pulwama, basically, 2019 for the BJP is a national security election. In fact, I would go so far as to say nationalism, in quotes, is the new Hindutva. So what Hindutva was to the BJP in let's say, the 90s, I think nationalism is to the BJP today. And I think the difference between earlier times and now is that Modi has managed to push his challengers on the defensive on this question. And no matter which way they cut and splice this, they don't get to win this argument. So if they stand by and say, we support you, they're the also-rans. If they stand by and counter it, they're the treacherous in quotes, sort of opponents who are skeptical about the military.
Undermining the armed services.
Yes. And there is a sentimentalism that I think Modi has successfully created around the military, around nationalism, around nationalist identity, and around the fact that he's presented himself as a decisive leader with an appetite for risk-taking. And I think that the opposition has not been able to come up with a counter-narrative to this. So I can't say for sure statistically what percentage of votes this would swing in this election, but certainly in my travels, I do find that people do talk about it. It may be more North-centric. You don't find that kind of conversation in the South, but it's definitely a big element in this election.
And net, it helps the ruling party.
It absolutely helps the ruling party.
So another security issue which has been at play, not at the same level perhaps, is this issue of illegal immigration, right? Especially in the East and the Northeast, where there are concerns about illegal Bangladeshi immigration. Can you help place this in context, especially for some of our international listeners? So are there parallels, for instance, between what's happening in the U.S.-Mexico border in terms of, you hear a lot of the same rhetoric, right? I mean, these are people who are infiltrators. They're here illegally. We have to cleanse the local population to get them out. We have to build up walls or structures or borders, literally or figuratively. How do you place this in context?
So just for context, this is something called the National Citizenship Register. And what the BJP is saying is that we would like a registry that will tell you who is a legal citizen and who is not. And so far, so good. Most people would not argue with the fact that you do need, every nation state would need to track who's there legally and who's there illegally. However, what makes their position different and particularly contentious is the very, very strong anti-Muslim sort of messaging of creating such a record. Because the BJP president, Amit Shah, has gone on record to say that other communities, so if you're Buddhist, I think he said Buddha in the tweet, but if you're Buddhist or you're Hindu and you're coming into India, you will be welcome. But if you are from, if you're Muslim coming in from Bangladesh, you're not welcome. Now, the emphasis here is not Bangladesh, it's on your religion. And this is clearly the BJP playing to expand its vote base in Bengal, in the eastern state of Bengal, where it seeks to increase its seats to offset some of the damages it may face in other states where it may not do that well as 2014. But I think there are serious ethical questions with this kind of formulation. And it would be akin to the debate here in the United States of America if Trump suddenly got up and said, I'm not going to allow immigrants to come in from Mexico, but if they want to come in from Russia, that's okay.
Right. Well, I mean, there was the Muslim ban, right?
Yes.
So in that sense,
yes.
Of course.
But it is Trumpian in that to that extent. It is Trumpian in the sense of sort of singling out a community, but putting the camouflage of legal versus illegal over it. If it's legality, then no infiltrator, in quotes, should be allowed in, right? Why is it religion specific?
Let me ask you a question about the Congress Party in this context, right? So a lot of people say one of the most interesting things about this election, and I've argued this myself, is that secularism really isn't on the menu in the sense that it has become coterminous with minority appeasement, right? And the Congress, given that 80% of India's population is Hindu, cannot afford to be seen as anti-Hindu. So therefore, their plank this election has been, let us try to reclaim Hinduism from Hindutva to say we wear our Hindu bona fides on our as a badge of honor, but we are not the same as the RSS and the Sangh Parivar. Is this potentially damaging to the larger cause of secularism in the sense that if we go down this path, then that old mantle of keeping a sort of equal distance, equal embrace of religions, that formulation, which is Nehruvian in its initial construct, kind of goes by the wayside.
So I think Nehruvian secularism has done its time.
It's dead.
It's dead. That does not mean secularism or pluralism has done its time, but the secularism as imagined in this sort of sanitized, one-arm removed way has A, done its time, and B, was never authentically practiced by the Congress party. And one of the things that has happened is that the Congress has a credibility crisis when it comes to the secularism conversation because of the historicity of several decisions taken by Congress leaders, you already know this, but very quickly, what was the Shah Bano case? Shah Bano was about a poor Muslim woman who sought alimony from her husband who was leaving her, and the Supreme Court said she should get that alimony. And Rajiv Gandhi, who was then Prime Minister, actually changed the law just so that alimony would not have to be paid. The emphasis was not on the alimony, but about courting the Muslim voter. So there is a sort of malpractice in the Congress construct of secularism, or the Congress claim to secularism, which is why today they are not able to be the purveyors of that secularism with authenticity or credibility. So secularism has become like this corroded political phrase, right? That, however, should not mean just because our politicians have let us down that as Indians, we should not sort of sound the alarm bells on what's happening today. And what's happening today is you have the BJP, which I think is pretty much in this campaign, as opposed to 2014, brazenly anti-Muslim. And you have the Congress that promises to be an alternative by being a party for all people. But when the Congress ran its campaign in Gujarat, the Congress very mindfully did not share the stage with Muslim leaders. You could call it a short-term tactic, but it just did not want to be seen as playing to Muslim voters anymore. So here's my question. If you're an Indian Muslim today, which party is speaking for you?
Right.
And just because the Congress failed the political test of secularism should not mean that to India as a country, and what makes us India is our diversity and our pluralism, that we don't be alarmed at the fact that is fragile today.
So I want to bring in here the Congress Party President Rahul Gandhi, right? Because in 2014, he was widely disparaged as frankly not ready for prime time, right? Untested and out of sync with the national mood. 5 years later, how, if at all, do you think things have changed? I mean, if I had to summarize the conventional wisdom, it would be something along the lines of he's more consistent, he's more diligent, he's more effective in delivering a one-liner, but yet he still suffers from a certain kind of credibility crisis in being seen as inauthentic. And just when you put him toe-to-toe, head-to-head with Mr. Modi somewhat deficient?
So I think the biggest change is that one thing you have to acknowledge is that Rahul Gandhi cannot be dismissed as a joke. I think there was a time when, with the so-called sort of Pappu pejoratives, he was being, just dismissed and laughed at.
He was at the butt of every WhatsApp meme or WhatsApp joke.
And you will find that the one thing that has shifted is there are enough WhatsApp jokes about Mr. Modi or Mr. Shah, just as they may continue to be about Rahul Gandhi or, Manmohan Singh or anyone else in the Congress, right? So that, I think, has equalized. I think today political humor should be, is applicable to all. Every politician should be the subject of satire in a healthy democracy. But earlier, that satire was reserved, or that mocking or that sneering was reserved for Rahul Gandhi. And the one thing I think you do have to give him credit for is that he has earned his spurs in terms of not losing his nerve at having been mocked and jeered and literally, caricatured by the media. So to that extent, I would say that you do see a vastly different Rahul Gandhi today. But the problem is that the Gandhis stand for a kind of politics that perhaps contemporary India is impatient for when presented with an alternative that is self-made. So Narendra Modi's big advantage over Rahul Gandhi or his sister Priyanka is that he's able to say, I came from nothing. I was a tea vendor's son. I reached here on my own. You inherited your power, right? Now, of course, the data will tell you that there are, statistically, the BJP and the Congress can go head to head in terms of dinners. But the top person, there, Modi has an advantage over Rahul. And I have always argued that the opposition cannot contest Narendra Modi on persona, so it has to contest him on arithmetic, at least as things stand today, because Modi has managed to make himself larger than his party. Rahul is not at that point, right? It's not like you say about the Congress, Gandhi is the message, but for the BJP, you say Modi is the message. This election is about Modi. Again.
Right. So, judging by the latest CSDS opinion poll, and you talked about this on your show, Modi's popularity has remained surprisingly intact, despite whatever bad economic news, farmer prices, unemployment, growth, so on and so forth. If this were an election about the fundamentals, the ruling BJP would be on the ropes. Now, the party yet, despite all of that, is widely expected to come back, perhaps not with the same kind of majority, but in some sort of a coalition. How do you explain to the outsider who looks at the economic numbers and then looks at his popularity and says, how is he outperforming where the economy and where the country seems to be?
So, the one thing about Modi is that he's a masterful political communicator, and he is able to package even really flawed decisions with the kind of narrative that seems to work in the short term. And the biggest example we have of that is demonetization. And demonetization was a disastrous economic decision. And I don't think it was disastrous just because of the way it was implemented. I think it was disastrous because it was not thought through, and it was it was an impetuous disruption of the Indian economy, and it hurt the daily wage laborer, the small farmer. It hurt really poor people. Yet I remember traveling into Uttar Pradesh, our most populous and political significant state at that time. And Modi had managed to create a narrative of class war and class envy. And he'd managed to package this as, oh, now the rich people are going to be standing in the same lines as all of you. And a lot of people just bought into that message. And the impact of demonetization came much later. So what you're seeing here today is actually Modi this time changing the message. So Modi does not want to talk about jobs and the economy right now, which is why you see this pivot to national security, which is why you see this pivot to self-respect. I've actually met sugarcane farmers in Uttar Pradesh who start by saying, oh, the price of sugarcane is a bigger deal than Rafale, referring to this sort of, what the Congress keeps saying is this arms procurement scam. So they say that, and then the next sentence they say, but India's image, today in the world, people say such great things about us. So that is percolating down. Yeah. And it is, it's a messaging trick. It's a messaging trick.
My friend and colleague here at Carnegie, Salman Ahmed, has been doing work on the middle class and U.S. foreign policy. So he's spent a lot of time in Ohio, not in the cities, in the towns, in the smaller places. And when the issue of the U.S.-China trade spat came up, where soybean farmers and ordinary Americans were seeing their pocketbooks hurt or their jobs at threat, the one thing they said is, well, that's true and that's not good, but somebody is standing up for us, right? Maybe there's some short-term pain to be incurred, but we believe that at the end of the tunnel, there'll be some long-term reward. And that sounds somewhat similar to what you're saying, right? I mean, we've accepted the short-term pain on the promise that of the available options, this is most likely our best.
So, you wrote this in the post when you said people are looking for excuses to give Modi another chance. And I used a somewhat more commonplace analogy at my Georgetown talk this morning, and it's worth repeating. And I said that for what I sense in voters is there isn't the same sort of euphoria for Modi that there was in 2014. But I compared it to the post-romance phase of a relationship. And I said, look, you start by dating someone and you think he's the best thing. And then 5 years later, you're like, okay, he can be a real jerk sometimes. He loses his temper. He doesn't, clean his laundry. I have to pick up after him. He talks badly to me. But you know what? I mean, he's okay. He's a known devil. And like, okay, maybe it's better than being single. And who else is there anyway? Until that someone else comes along, you stay in that relationship. So I'm saying, to me, it seems that voters are saying, yeah, there are things that Modi has done that disappoint us. There are speeches that he's made that we don't like. We don't like the use of soldiers to court votes. A lot of people I asked said that's not correct. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the sort of communal language that he's used in this campaign. But if you push them, they'll always come with a but. Who else is there? And this is a failure of India's opposition to, one, have a counter-narrative, and two, to remain divided. Because surely any commonsensical sort of back-of-the-envelope math would tell you that the only way you can take on Modi in this environment is to localize the election, is to actually fight 543 seats and not... Modi wants a presidential election. You cannot be giving him a presidential election. You cannot be making him the message. The more you actually personally attack him as an opposition leader, the more you strengthen him.
Right.
So you need to localize. But are you localizing? I'm not sure. I think Pulwama and Balakot paralyzed the opposition also for a couple of weeks.
And it's not clear that the alliances that they'd hoped to form are coming together, where you can say the Congress tried to drive too hard of a bargain in Uttar Pradesh. An alliance is perhaps up for grabs in Delhi with the Aam Aadmi Party. It hasn't materialized. And so this idea of prosecuting a state-by-state campaign has large patches of that narrative have not been filled out yet.
Yes, and I mean, Yashwant Sinha, who is no fan of Modi anymore, but I think he said this well, and I was doing an interview with him, and he said the BJP is actually giving up seats it holds to please its allies. Looking at Bihar, where Nitish Kumar and the BJP are contesting on an equal number of seats, even though Nitish Kumar won 2 seats in the last election.
Right, and BJP incumbent MPs have to give up.
Yes, right? And then you look at the Congress that doesn't hold seats and it's still fighting... it's still fighting for some long-term revamp. And my point to a number of Congress politicians I know, and I've had some very sort of agitated arguments with them on this, is that your long-term revival cannot be your project when you're literally gasping for existence, right? So when you're gasping for existence, you take the oxygen mask. When you're gasping for breath, you take the oxygen mask from whoever offers it to you. You don't at that point say, oh, now I'm going to get my fitness back. You're going to get your fitness back. You're going to run that marathon maybe 2 years later, right? And you just have to survive. So I just find that a peculiar thing in the opposition mindset. I think they got complacent after December's assembly election results. I think they thought they were back in the game, and they underestimated Narendra Modi.
So let me end this conversation, Barkha, by asking about women. There's been a lot written about women voters, the way in which female turnout is converging to men's turnout. We may even see parity. Of course, there's still a registration gap,
yes.
So we know that women are under-registered. But in terms of who's on the rolls, who comes out to vote, you travel around the country quite a bit, and you talk to different people and talk to a lot of voters. What sorts of messages are resonating with female voters? So one of the arguments you typically hear is that the female voter is more discerning about governance, that she is less likely to be swayed by, say, caste and religion, sectarian identity, and thinking more about the big picture. Do you find that disaggregation, or do you think that women voters are just like men voters? They're broken up by the same sorts of divisions that, the rest of it.
So, the analogy would be, like, everybody thought that women would vote for Hillary. Like, why would women in America not want America to get its first female president? It doesn't work that way. We saw that white women voted for Trump, despite all the odious things he said about women, and was on tape saying them. So I believe that women have not been mobilized in India into being a voting bloc, right? There is no gendered dimension to mainstream politics yet. I'm not saying it won't come. I think that effort has not been made. I think what also happens is that there's this very patriarchal there's a patriarchal understanding of the female voter. So you'll have the BJP saying things like, oh, we did the gas subsidies, cooking gas subsidies, so women will vote on that, or we struck down triple talaq. I think what could be a voting issue is something like public safety. I think women care about being able to walk on the street. I think women really, really care about public safety or the right to get an education, right? I think these are the things that really matter to women. But I don't see this being mainstreamed. And I don't see the female voter being organized or mobilized or channeled. I see glimmers of Priyanka Gandhi Vadra attempting to position herself as a voice for the female voter, but it's too subtle, it's too sort of disorganized and amorphous right now, but there are glimmers of that. But I haven't seen a single politician actually trying to court the female voter. So I don't buy right now that the female voter will vote fundamentally different from the male voter.
Barkha, thanks so much for joining us on the show. We covered everything from female voters to Modi to the Kargil War, social media. I hope you'll come back, and congratulations on the new gig.
Thank you so much, Milan. Pleasure to be here.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Duax our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.